Hello, this is the Impact Calc lecture. So before we get into how to do Impact Calc, I just want to give a brief overview of what it is and why it's important. Impact Calc is a method or a framework through which you instruct the judge how they should evaluate which impact comes first in the debate. And this Impact Calc is super important because given that you're both accessing your impacts, if you prove that your impact matters more than your opponent's impact just on face, your judge has a heavy inclination to vote for you. And the way you do impact calc is through three different ways. So one is probability, two is time frame, and three is magnitude. So for the first one, probability, it's just an evaluation of which impact is more likely to happen or which impact is more likely to cause extinction, for example, if you're both reading extinction impacts. A good example of this is from the JanFeb topic. If you're AF versus the bioweapons DA and you're reading the whole res AF with the nuclear war impact, a good weighing claim you can make is the nuclear war impact has a much higher probability of causing extinction because of things like nuclear winter. So there's a much higher likelihood that you access the extinction impact than the bioweapons DA because it's far less likely that a disease that can be prevented, that can be fought against with countermeasures and social distancing, for example, it's much less likely that that disease would result in extinction. And you could also attack the link of the DA and just say, like, if bioweapons aren't a great substitute for nuclear weapons, so states won't necessarily shift, which is another way that you can weigh between your impacts. The second way you could do weighing is through time frame. This is just an evaluation of which impact happens first. A good example of this from the November-December fossil fuels topic is if you're neg versus an AF that has a climate change impact, and you read the econ DA in your 1NC, and the 2NR, you could very easily make the claim that, hey, climate change will take a long time to cause extinction, whereas economic collapse causing a lash out war or causing resource wars, for example, has a much shorter time frame to cause that extinction than does climate change. So you're winning like that your impact happens first. And the way you really want to finish out this impact weighing claim is that time frame is making some argument about why time frame should come first. And that argument could be time frame should come first because if we prevent the impact that's happening first, then we can use the extra time we have to solve the later impact. And the third way you can do impact calc is through magnitude. A good example of this is if you're neg on this JanFeb topic and you read defense on the nuclear winter impact scenario that the AF reads, let's assume that that's the only scenario they read, then you can make the argument that the bioweapons DA has a much higher magnitude than the AF's nuke winter impact because nuclear winter doesn't necessarily cause extinction as per your card, but the bioweapons DA does through the spreading of disease. Generally speaking, between all three of these, probability, time frame, and magnitude, the judge generally views the debate through a lens of probability times magnitude. And the reason they do this is because they need to take into account how many people the impact would affect, but they measure it through probability because they need some way to filter that. If it has a super low probability, then it doesn't matter. But you can make arguments to sway how the judge evaluates these impacts. For example, you can make an argument that magnitude has to come before everything, specifically extinction must come before everything because extinction is irreversible. You can also make an argument for why probability should come first because there are an infinite number of existential threats present at every moment in time, and if we evaluate those first, then we wouldn't be able to successfully pass any meaningful policy because those events have such a low chance of occurring, and we need to spend all our resources into preventing these super low probability events, which just leads to policy paralysis. So therefore, we need to evaluate probability first. And lastly, you could make an argument that time frame should come first because we need to prioritize mitigating the most imminent threats before later ones because we can use the extra time we have after the earlier impact to prevent the later impact, but we don't have that extra time if we prioritize the later impact first. We can also take impact calc one step further and An example of more advanced impact calculus would be saying something like the dA turns the case. And what that means is the impact of the dA results in the impact of the AF. So if we avoid the dA by not doing the AF, then we avoid both impacts, which puts you in an excellent position to win the debate. But one big thing about making this argument is that time frame or winning time frame is really important here, because if you make the argument that the dA turns the case, but then the AF wins that their impact happens before the neg's impact, then it doesn't really matter if the dA turns the case, because then your impact's happening later, so it can't result in the impact of the AF happening again. That wouldn't work. So given that you've one time frame, a good example of the dA turns the case is if you're neg reading the deterrence dA versus the US ICBM's AF that has a US-Russia war impact. So the thesis of the deterrence dA is that if the US gets rid of their ICBMs, then Russia will be incentivized to first strike in order to deal more harm to the US's nuclear capability or nuclear force, and that will result in a US-Russia war. So this is a great example of how the dA turns the case, because you're making the argument that doing the AF of getting rid of the US ICBMs causes the impact of the AF to occur, or a US-Russia war to occur, and that's a really powerful turn, because winning that turn means that the AF is most certainly a bad idea, and that also means that you will most likely win the debate. Another direction in which you could take more advanced impact calc is using the internal links of your dA to turn the internal links of the AF. And an example of this is from the Jan-Feb topic of 2019, which says that the US should not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. And if you're neg reading the military-to-military relations disad with a disease impact versus an Egypt AF with a human rights impact, basically, the thesis of the AF was that Egypt was an oppressive authoritarian government, which limited a lot of human rights in Egypt because of that. And the thesis of the dA was that without military-to-military relations and cooperation between the Egyptian military and the US military, there would not be enough surveillance to prevent disease. But there was also an argument in the dA that these military relations led to army professionalization. So a really good impact calc argument you can make is that the DA's internal link of the AFs cutting off military relations and thus ending army professionalization turns the AF's internal link of the Egyptian state abusing their power, because that professionalization acted as a limit on the abuse of the police state. And note that this kind of impact calc is really useful because it means that you can turn the case even if there's impact defense read on your impact. And another example of more advanced impact calc would be saying that your impact solves the AF's internal link, or in other words, saying that solving your impact would solve for their internal link into their impact. A great example of this would be from the 2019 November-December fossil fuels topic. If you're reading the econ dA versus a warming AF, you can make the argument that econ decline leads to people using dirtier fuel sources because they shift to cheaper inputs, which would be dirtier fuel. But by contrast, in periods of economic growth, people would shift to cleaner fuel because they have more resources, which would solve for warming. And overall, when you're keeping in mind all of these different tactics to perform impact calc, it's always good to bear in mind that impact calc is comparative, and you always need reasons why your impact matters more than your opponent's, not just why your impact matters in a vacuum. So overall, impact calc is super important to decide how the judge should prioritize impacts, and you should definitely do a lot of it in your debates.